Hi, today we're going to talk about the central nervous system. Neuroglial cells are often referred to as glial cells. They are the connective tissue cells of the central nervous system, which support the neurons both physically and metabolically, including your eristocytes, oligodendrocytes, epidermal cells, and the microglia. So your glial cells support the interneurons physically, metabolically, and functionally. And about 90% of the cells within the central nervous system are not neurons, but your glial cells or your neuroglia. The glial cells inhabit only about half of the area of the brain, as they don't branch out like your neurons do. Your glial cells also differ from the neurons as they do not lose their power to undergo cell division. Okay, let's look at an overview of the location and the function of the different brain regions. Your frontal lobe is a part of the cerebral cortex, and it's divided into a right and a left side. So if you'll look at the bones of the skull, the lobes correspond to those. The frontal lobe is near the frontal bone on your skull. The frontal corresponds to the front of the brain. One side of each of the brain controls the opposite side of the body, so the frontal lobe is involved in your memory formation. Then we have your temporal lobes, which are located on each side near your ears. They're involved in memory and hearing while processing information from the senses such as taste, smell, and sound. The temporal lobe is also involved in memory storage. Then your parietal lobe is located between the occipital and the frontal lobes and above the temporal lobe, and it's named for its proximity to the parietal bone on your skull. The occipital lobe is at the back of the brain. It processes your images, so it processes information from your eyes as well as the visual images from your memory. It's the smallest of the lobes, and it's involved in visual spacing, movement, and color recognition. Then we have the cerebellum, which is at the very back. It's where the spinal cord meets the brain. The cerebellum regulates motor functions, voluntary movements such as posture, balance, coordination, and speech. This is an area where my mother-in-law had a brain tumor. This is the key area for learning motor behaviors. Even though it accounts for only 10% of the brain, it has almost half of the brain's neurons. The brain's neurons transmit the electrical signals. So next is the brainstem, and it is at the base of the brain, and it is connected to the spinal cord. The brainstem controls the messages between the brain and the rest of the body. The brainstem also controls breathing, swallowing, heart rate, blood pressure, consciousness, being awake or sleepy. So the brainstem consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. When my mother-in-law had her tumor in her cerebellum, it was actually very close to the brainstem, so they couldn't get it all. They had to be very careful because they didn't want to do anything that would impair her ability to breathe, her heart rate, swallowing. Next, let's look at the structure and the function of the meninges. These are the three membranes that wrap the brain and the spinal cord. They're three protective and nourishing membranes. They lie between the bony covering and the nervous tissue. So they wrap all of the central nervous system. From the outermost to the innermost layer, they are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Mater simply means mother, like a protective mother role. The neurons cannot divide to replace damaged cells, but the body can be protected by the wrapping of these meninges, and it is also surrounded by a hard bony covering. Then we have the cerebral spinal fluid that flows within and around the brain to cushion it against hard physical impact. Then we have the blood-brain barrier that limits access of blood-borne substances to the brain. Our brains depend on the constant supply of delivery of oxygen and glucose because it can't generate ATP in the absence of either of those. And if you'll remember, ATP is your energy. So let's talk a little bit more about the blood-brain barrier, or what we call the gatekeeper. Your blood-brain barrier is highly selective and it regulates exchanges between the blood and the brain. This limits the harmful changes into the blood-brain tissue. It protects against chemical injury. So it will let the helpful substances across the barrier and it keeps the harmful out. There have been several antibodies to treat diseases such as Alzheimer's, and they are too big to cross the blood-brain barrier, which limits its effectiveness. They've been looking at ones and they've determined that about 0.1% of the injected antibody actually gets across the blood-brain barrier that removes the plaque for Alzheimer's disease. So Roche, a pharmaceutical company, has been looking at a way to shuttle or increase the uptake by binding the antibody to a receptor so that they can deliver that larger molecule into the brain. The blood-brain barrier, however, doesn't protect all of the brain, but some of the areas that it doesn't protect are the posterior pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the medium eminence of the hypothalamus, and the area postrema. The area of the postrema gathers toxins and it'll make you vomit so that more toxins don't enter your body. So that's an effective way to keep you from getting more poison in your body. But these are all essential for hormone release. So hormones are only effective in the bloodstream, so it's vital that they have access. Okay, next, let's look at the, if you look at the diagram, you will see in the top of it where the frontal lobe is and the parietal lobe. Then the yellow and the blue areas will correspond to your primary motor cortex and your primary sensory cortex. The primary motor cortex is located in the frontal lobes and it controls the skeletal muscles. The sensory cortex is the region of the parietal lobe immediately behind the central sulcus, the site of the initial processing of somosynthetic and proprioceptive into the mesosensory cortex. And basically when you hear the words somosynthetic, it means we're talking about body feelings. So these are things such as touch, pressure, heat, cold, pain, and this is what we refer to them collectively. The cortical homunculus is what we call this diagram over here, and it's a distorted representation of the human body based on a neurological map that links areas of the body and portions of the brain dedicated to either a specific motor function or sensory function. The word is Latin for little man, and it was used in folklore before we had scientific literature. So it's also referred to as the cortex man, and it illustrates basically how the body lays within the brain. The nerve fibers from the spinal cord terminate in various areas of the parietal lobe and the cerebral cortex, which forms a representation on the map. So when you look at it, you'll see where the hands are or the elbows are. Okay, when we speak properly in a meaningful manner, we can only do this when the Broca's area is functioning properly. Speaking the right words that make sense at that moment of time is a major task of this portion of the brain. So if you look at the diagram, you'll see the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. So in the Wernicke's area, it's responsible for making us understand the language that is heard. It essentially allows us to grasp the statements made by the speaker. And the Broca's area is it generates articulate speech. It's passed down to motor cortex, which regulates the movement of the lips and the tongue. And the tongue and the lips movements are coordinated as per the input given by the Broca's area and the motor cortex. So the Broca's area, the speech production unit of the brain, also helps in expressing thoughts into words. So you have to have both of those performing. Next, let's look at the different cranial nerves, and this is looking at the underside of the brain. We've got 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, and 5 cranial nerves. Each of these nerves relay sensations from a region of skin to the brain. The nervous system is composed of 12 pairs of cranial nerves that controls all of our body processes, motor and sensory. The cranial nerves are located at the bottom portion of the brain, distributed into the 4 main parts: the diencephalon, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. When you look on the diagram, the yellow areas where the diagram draws a line across there corresponds to each nerve. Okay, why are dermatomes important? If you look at this diagram, this shows you some. A dermatome is an area of skin that is mostly supplied by a single spinal nerve. The nerves root at the spinal cord and branch off to reach the rest of the body. So, for example, pain is felt at the periphery or the outermost parts of the body, and they transmit things such as pain, touch, and temperature. And to understand this, you need to look at the spinal cord and how it's actually divided into 31 segments. The nerves, which are pairs, come in, and the ones on the front and the back nerves are actually different. So the anterior roots on the front do the motor signals for the body, and the posterior nerves, which are on the back, signal pain as well as sensory signals. Okay, so this is just a brief overview of the central nervous system. We looked at the neuroglial cells, which are the connective tissue of the central nervous system. Then we broke it down and we looked at the major brain regions. And then we looked at the meninges, the 3 layers that wrap the brain and the spinal cord. And then we took a look into the blood-brain barrier and how that shuttles things across, or it blocks things across the barrier. And then we looked at the primary motor cortex and the primary sensory cortex and how they interact. Then we looked at the cranial nerves and the dermatomes. Thank you. Here's a list of all the works that were cited for this PowerPoint.